Your great-grandmother's recipes are vanishing right now. Not from fire, not from flood, not from any disaster you can see coming. They are vanishing because nobody is asking her the one question that matters, the mistake she made that taught her how to fix it. In homes across Lancaster County and Ohio and Indiana, there are women and men in their 80s and 90s who know survival skills you cannot find in any modern cookbook. But here is what nobody tells you. The recipes written down in your grandmother's hand are not the real knowledge. The real knowledge is locked in the stories she never wrote. The stories about why the butter separated, why the canned beans turned soft one year and stayed firm the next, why she added salt exactly when she did, not before, not after. Those stories, the failure stories, the problem-solving stories, they die with her, unless you ask for them differently. Most people think food preservation is about the recipe. Get the ingredients right, follow the steps, and you are done. The Amish understand something deeper. It is about reading what the food is telling you. A recipe is just permission to start. The real technique is in the adjustment, and every single adjustment comes from a mistake someone made and decided to learn from instead of throw away. I have spent the last 3 years interviewing Amish families who have been preserving food the same way for 4 and 5 generations. And I discovered something that changes everything about how you should be learning these skills. Are you ready? Write this down if you are taking notes. The recipes that survive are not the ones that were written down first. The recipes that survive are the ones that failed publicly, often, and in front of witnesses who remembered them. Think about it. If a recipe works perfectly every time, nobody talks about it. Nobody tells the story. It just becomes routine. But when something goes wrong, when the apple butter breaks, when the vinegar is too sharp, when the jelly never sets, that becomes a story. That becomes the thing you tell at Sunday dinner. That becomes the thing your sister-in-law asks about. And that becomes the thing that actually gets remembered and passed down, because it was interesting enough to be worth the telling. The modern assumption is that more precision equals better preservation. We print recipes. We standardize temperatures. We buy equipment that measures everything to the gram. But there is a paradox hiding in this approach. The more you rely on the recipe, the less resilient you become. If you cannot preserve food without your printed instructions, what happens when you are in a situation where you do not have them? What happens when you are preserving a crop you have never seen before? What happens when the season is unusual, or the weather is strange, or your fruit ripens 2 weeks earlier than the recipe anticipated? Your Amish neighbors do not look at a recipe. They look at the apples. They assess the ripeness, the sugar content, the age of the fruit. They taste something as they cook and they adjust. When the syrup is not as thick as it should be, they add more sugar. When it is already too thick, they add a splash of water. These are not recipe instructions. These are real-time decisions made on the fly, and they can only be made if you have been trained since childhood to read the signs. But here is the part that most people miss completely. The Amish families who have the best preservation skills, the ones whose recipes are most reliable, the ones whose food lasts longest in the cellar, they did not learn from a single source. They learned by watching failures happen in real time and being part of the problem-solving conversation afterward. A daughter would see her mother's butter separate. She would ask why. Her mother would not just explain what went wrong. She would explain what she would do differently next time, and what she learned from the last time that same thing happened, which was 7 years ago. This knowledge is not stored in a recipe book. It is stored in conversation. It is stored in the decision trees that form in your mind after you have seen the same problem multiple times and watched it get solved in multiple ways, depending on what resources are available and what the circumstances are. It is stored in your hands, in your nose, in the patterns your eye recognizes. Most people think the reason Amish families preserve food better than modern families is because they have some secret ingredient or some ancient recipe that works better. That is not it at all. The reason is simpler and more powerful. They have been apprenticed since they were old enough to stand on a stool and reach the counter. By the time they are 12, they have already made butter dozens of times, so when the butter breaks, it is not a catastrophe. It is a variation they already know how to handle. By the time they are 18, they have already put up 300 quarts of food, minimum, in different conditions, different seasons, different crops. By the time they are 25, they have logged 5,000 hours of hands-on preservation work. Compare that to the average American home where food preservation is not something you do twice a week for your entire life. It is something you try once or twice a year if you get around to it, usually from a recipe you found online yesterday. You are trying to compress 5,000 hours of apprenticeship into 5 hours of annual attention. So if you want to actually preserve your family's recipes, the real ones, not just the written ones, you have to think about preservation differently. It is not about writing down what your grandmother makes. It is about documenting the process through which she makes it and, more importantly, the moment when something goes slightly wrong and how she decides to adjust. This is the part where most family recipe documentation fails. You ask your grandmother to write down her recipes, or you buy her a nice cookbook where she can record them. She fills it out, and you have maybe 60% of what you need. You have ingredients, amounts, rough timing. What you do not have is the 1,000 small decisions she makes while she is working. You do not have the exact moment she tastes it and decides it needs more lemon. You do not have the reason she adds butter at the end instead of the beginning. You do not have the story about the year her apples were especially tart, so she had to adjust the sugar. An Amish friend of mine named Sarah, she is 64 years old, and I asked her to write down her apple butter recipe. She gave me a list of ingredients and rough instructions. Then I asked her the follow-up question that nobody asks. What do you do if the apple butter is still too thin after you have cooked it for 2 hours? Her face changed. She realized right then that she had left out the most important part. She does not cook it for a set amount of time. She cooks it until it passes a test. When a small amount dripped onto a cold plate sets and does not flow back together, it is done. And that test exists because 1 year, 20 years ago, she overcooked an entire batch and it turned into hard candy, not spreadable butter. She almost threw it all away, but instead, she kept a small jar and experimented with what temperature made it spreadable again, and she found out that adding a small amount of water back in and cooking it differently worked. Now that year of failure is embedded in every batch she makes for the rest of her life. That is the knowledge you cannot preserve in a recipe card. That is the knowledge you can only preserve by being in the kitchen with someone, watching her work, asking her questions when something happens that is different from the standard instructions, and listening to the stories that explain why she makes the choices she does. Here is what changed my understanding of how to actually preserve family knowledge. I realized that the moment a recipe becomes standardized and written down, it becomes fragile. It becomes a monument instead of a living thing. The living thing is the technique, the skill in your hands, the judgment in your eye, the experience that lets you read a situation and respond in real time. And that only survives through apprenticeship, through showing, through doing it wrong and fixing it, and through the stories that explain why each step matters. That is the difference between having a recipe and having a skill. A recipe is instructions. A skill is understanding. And understanding only comes when you are standing next to someone who knows, watching their face when they decide something is ready, hearing them say, "No, not yet," or "This one is going to be different because of the weather." That kind of knowledge is what kept the Amish communities alive through famines, harsh winters, and seasons when the modern supply chain did not exist to catch them. Let me tell you about something the Plain communities have always known that modern food preservation has almost completely buried. Food preservation is not about stopping time. It is about understanding decay and working with it instead of against it. Your great-grandmother did not have a refrigerator, and she did not need one because she understood fermentation, smoking, salting, and how to read food for the signals that tell you whether it is still safe. Fermentation is the oldest form of food preservation on Earth. We are talking about a technique that goes back at least 10,000 years. Before electricity, before canning jars, before refrigeration of any kind, people in every culture on this planet figured out that if you submerge vegetables in salt water in a cool place, the natural bacteria on the surface of the plant will eat the sugars and create lactic acid, which preserves the food and makes it safer to eat than the raw vegetables ever were. The salt creates an environment where the good bacteria thrive and the bad bacteria cannot survive. And here is the thing that changed. We stopped trusting our senses. A woman in an Amish kitchen today knows that if her ferment smells sour and pungent, if it bubbles when she opens the lid, if the vegetables are still firm and the brine is still clear, then it is alive and safe. She does not need a pH meter. She does not need a thermometer. She does not need a guarantee from a factory. She knows because she has made it 50 times. She knows because her mother made it this way and her mother before that, and they did not have food poisoning from ferments. They had fewer illnesses, actually, because fermented foods are full of beneficial bacteria that modern pasteurized food strips away. But here is where the knowledge almost died. The moment commercial food processing became possible, the moment we could buy pickles in a jar that would never ferment and never sour and never surprise us, the moment canning jars made it possible to preserve without fermentation, people stopped teaching their daughters and sons how to trust their senses. They stopped teaching them how to tell the difference between the smell of a living ferment and the smell of spoilage. And that skill, that judgment, is what actually kept people alive. The Amish still do this. They still ferment cabbage into sauerkraut the way it has been made for hundreds of years. They still make pickled vegetables. They still cure meat in salt, and they still teach it to their children, showing them every step, letting them fail, letting them learn what safety actually feels like and sounds like and smells like, not what a label promises. Let me walk you through what this actually looks like in practice, because fermentation is the gateway skill to everything else. Once you understand fermentation, you understand preservation. You start with cabbage. Any cabbage works, but the Amish prefer the dense heads, the kind that have spent the whole season growing solid and tight. You remove the outer leaves, not the ones that will go into the ferment, but the ones that will cover the top, because those outer leaves are your insurance. They keep the vegetables submerged under the brine, and they keep the air off the surface. Oxygen is the enemy of fermentation. Air is where mold grows. Submerged vegetables in salt water do not mold. You slice the cabbage thin, not paper thin. That is modern food processing thinking. Thick enough that the pieces stay intact and have some texture. The thickness matters because a thin slice ferments in a week, but a thicker slice stays crunchy and firm for months. And in the lean months of winter, when fresh vegetables are impossible, that crunch is not just texture, it is a message to your body that you are eating something alive and good. You layer the sliced cabbage in your crock, and here is where technique matters. You sprinkle each layer with salt, not a pinch, an actual measured amount. The Amish use roughly 2% of the weight of the cabbage in salt. If you have 2 pounds of cabbage, you use about 40 grams of salt. But more important than the exact number is understanding why. Salt draws the water out of the cabbage. The cabbage sits on top of the salt, and within minutes, you see liquid pooling on the surface. That liquid is brine. It is the salt dissolving in the cabbage's own water, and the weight of the cabbage on top of itself is what makes it work. You layer and you press, until all the cabbage is in the crock, and it is sitting in its own liquid. If you do not have enough liquid to cover the vegetables, you add a saltwater solution, the same ratio, 2% salt, water that has been boiled and cooled. You place one of those outer leaves on top to keep everything below submerged. And then, this is important, you do nothing. You do not seal it. You do not cover it tight. You leave it open to the air, because fermentation creates gas. The bacteria are eating the sugars and making carbon dioxide and lactic acid, and that gas needs somewhere to escape. If you seal it, the pressure builds, and the jar breaks, or the lid pops, or things go wrong in ways that medieval preservationists never had to worry about, because they were not trying to be perfect. You put it in a cool place. Room temperature is fine. 50 to 70 degrees is actually ideal. And then you wait. In 3 days, the cabbage will have transformed. The liquid will be cloudy. If you open the crock and smell it, you will smell something sharp and alive and different from anything in a store. That smell is the bacteria working. That is the sign that everything is exactly right. In 7 to 10 days, the transformation is complete. The cabbage has become sauerkraut. It tastes tangy and alive. It is safe indefinitely if it stays submerged and cool. It will actually last longer than any canned food because the living bacteria inside it prevent spoilage. And every bite of it contains the knowledge of 1,000 years of people who figured out that you do not need electricity or chemicals or modern technology to preserve food. You just need salt, patience, and the willingness to listen to what the food is telling you. But fermentation is only one piece of this lost knowledge. The Amish also preserve through smoking, through salting meat, through drying, through pickling with vinegar, and through cold storage in ways that the modern world has almost completely forgotten about. Each technique teaches you something different about how food actually stays safe, and each one comes with its own set of sensory skills that you have to learn by doing. Cold storage, for instance. Before the refrigerator, the root cellar was the most important building on any farm. It was built partially underground, with thick walls and a dirt floor, and it maintained a natural temperature of 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, without any electricity, without any chemicals, without any machinery. The temperature stayed constant, because the earth around it moderated the extremes. A root cellar will keep root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, fresh for 6 to 8 months without them sprouting or rotting. It will keep apples into the spring. It will keep cheese and cured meat indefinitely. And it works through a principle that modern food science knows, but modern home kitchens have completely abandoned: temperature stability and humidity control. You do not need to be Amish to build one. You do not even need to understand the science. You just need to understand that your great-grandmother did not have a refrigerator and her food stayed fresh all winter. Ask yourself, how? The answer is not technology. The answer is knowledge about how to work with your environment instead of against it. And that is the core of everything I want you to understand about these lost survival skills. They were not invented by people who had laboratories or universities or research grants. They were invented by people who had to survive. People who had no choice but to figure out how to keep their children fed when the harvest ended. People who had to make sure their family had clean water in the middle of winter when the well froze solid. People who could not call an ambulance, so they had to know which plants would stop bleeding and which would bring down a fever. Every single one of these skills, fire without matches, water purification with plants, food preservation in cold storage, shelter building from raw materials, was born from necessity. And here is what should matter to you. That necessity has not gone away. It has just been hidden. We have covered it up with electricity and plastic and the assumption that the grid will always be there. But grids fail, refrigerators break down, supply chains snap. And when they do, the person who knows how to build a shelter will survive. The person who knows how to purify water will not get sick. The person who knows how to preserve food without electricity will not starve. I am not saying this to frighten you. I am saying this because I have watched the world change more in the last 30 years than it changed in the 200 years before that, and I have watched what we have lost in that change. I have watched young people who cannot start a fire. I have watched families who do not know where their food comes from. I have watched people panic when the power goes out for a single day. But I have also watched what happens when people decide to learn. I have watched a 40-year-old accountant who had never built anything pick up an axe and learn to split wood. I have watched a suburban mother take charcoal and salt and actually purify water that came from a questionable source. I have watched teenagers learn to navigate by the stars and realize that their phone is not the only tool they have. And here is what surprised them all. It was not as hard as they thought. None of these skills requires a genius-level intellect. They require patience. They require practice. They require the willingness to be a beginner and make mistakes. And they are all learnable. Every single one. So let me give you a starting point, a roadmap. If you are going to begin, and I hope you will, do not start with the hardest skill. Do not try to build a log cabin your first week. Start with the skills that compound. Start with the ones that teach you how to think. First, learn to purify water, not because it is the most essential, though it is, but because learning to purify water teaches you to observe. It teaches you to ask questions. Is this water clear or cloudy? Is it moving or stagnant? What is upstream from here? What lives in this water naturally? When you learn to purify water, you learn to think like a survivor. You learn to look at your environment and ask what it is telling you. Second, learn to make fire. Not just with matches. Learn the friction methods. Learn the flint and steel method. Learn to gather tinder and kindling and fuel wood and understand the difference between all three. Fire is the foundation of everything else. Once you can make fire, you can boil water. You can cook food, you can stay warm, you can signal for help, you can preserve meat by smoking it. Fire is not one skill. It is the master skill that unlocks everything else. Third, learn to preserve food. Start with the methods that do not require building anything or understanding chemistry. Learn to salt meat. Learn to dry vegetables. Learn to smoke fish. Learn to make pickles. These are not just survival skills. They are food skills that will genuinely improve your life right now. You will make your own bacon. You will dry your own tomatoes. You will understand flavor in a way that grocery store food never taught you. Fourth, learn basic shelter building. You do not need to build a full cabin. Learn to build a lean-to. Learn to build a debris shelter. Learn what materials your local area provides and how to use them. This teaches you spatial thinking. It teaches you material science without calling it that. It teaches you to look at a pile of branches and a sheet of bark and see shelter instead of waste. And fifth, learn to identify wild plants. Not to become a forager overnight, but to know 10 plants in your area that you can eat. To know 5 plants that have medicine. To know 3 plants that have other uses. Fiber, fire starter, water container. This teaches you to see your environment differently. You walk through a park, and instead of seeing nothing, you see resources. These 5 skills, water, fire, food preservation, shelter, plants, are the foundation. If you master these 5, you have moved from helpless to capable. You have moved from what do I do if to I know what to do. And that confidence changes everything. I grew up learning these skills the way children in my community always have, not through lessons or YouTube videos, but through doing. Through watching my grandfather split kindling and then picking up an axe myself. Through seeing my grandmother dry beans and then helping her hang them on strings. Through being asked to find specific plants and learning to look carefully at leaves and stems and smell and taste. But you do not have to grow up Amish to learn this. You have to be willing to be a student. You have to be willing to slow down. You have to be willing to make mistakes. You have to accept that learning to start a fire without matches might take you 50 tries before it works, and that 50th try will feel like a miracle. The world will not stop changing. Technology will keep advancing. The grid will continue to exist, probably. But what will not change is this. The person who knows how to survive is always more powerful than the person who depends on systems they do not understand. The person who can start a fire is freer than the person who cannot. The person who can find clean water is more secure than the person who waits for someone to turn on a tap. The person who can grow food and preserve it is less afraid of hunger. These are not nostalgic skills. They are not about going backward or rejecting modern life. They are about having choices. They are about understanding your own capability. They are about knowing that whatever happens, you have tools, you have knowledge, you have agency. So I want to invite you genuinely, to pick one of these 5 skills and commit to learning it over the next month. Choose the one that calls to you. If you are terrified of making fire, start there. If you think you already know how to purify water, prove it to yourself. If you have always been curious about wild plants, spend the next 4 weeks learning to identify 10 species in your area. I have put together a comprehensive guide that walks you through each of these skills step by step. It includes the history of how they were used, the exact methods that work, the most common mistakes people make, and a progression that takes you from beginner to truly competent over 12 weeks if you work steadily. You will find it linked below. It is called The Lost Skills Manual, 75 Forgotten Survival Techniques Your Ancestors Knew by Heart. And if you work through it, you will not be someone who wonders what they would do. You will be someone who knows. Thank you for watching this far. If you found this valuable, if you learned something new about how these skills matter in your own life, please like this video. Subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the skill-by-skill deep dives that are coming. Turn on the notification bell. These videos take time to make carefully, and I post them because I believe you deserve to have access to knowledge that keeps you free and capable. I am grateful you are here, learning, and remembering what your great-grandparents already knew.